Hello Year 9. In this lesson we're looking at how to answer a 12-mark source question on the Rhineland. You should already have done the Rhineland knowledge lesson. If you haven't done that, please go back and do that first. It's in my YouTube channel. You can't access this lesson if you don't know anything about what happened in the Rhineland. You also should have done the starter for today's lesson with your teacher. So I want to take you through how to answer a particular question. Now, what I want you to do is, if you have the ability to print, it'd be a really good idea to print your copy of these two sources. If you can't, do not panic at all. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to turn to a double page in your exercise book if you've got it. If not, just an A4 piece of lined paper and turn it onto its side so it's landscape rather than portrait. And I'd like you at the very top of that page to write, how useful are sources A and B to historians studying Hitler's actions in the Rhineland? This is a 12-mark question, so if you could write that at the top of a double page, that would be fantastic. So maybe just pause this for a second so you can get that jotted down. Then, if you can print, stick the printout in the middle of that double page. So you've got the title, the exam question at the top, and then you've got this kind of beneath that in the middle. So you're going to be able to write annotations around both sources. If you can't print, it does not matter at all. What I want you to do is kind of list your ideas as we're going through. Source A on one page, so you've got one double page beside your double page here, one here, source A here, source B here, ready to kind of list some of the things that you can see and maybe some of the knowledge that you're going to put to go with that. So that's just our setting up to make sure that we're ready to have a look at these two sources. Source A is a cartoon. What I would like you to do on your first page where you've written source A or near where you've printed in the cartoon is I want you to put as many annotations on this as possible. What can you see? What's going on? I'm going to lead you through these annotations in a couple of minutes, but what I want you to do is make as many observations as you can on your own first. So either list them on your source A page or write around the source if you can. Pause this and have a go at that now. Let's have a look at what I got. When I was looking at this particular cartoon, I noticed a number of different things. So the first thing that I noticed was in the background here, we have got Nazi flags in the windows. What these Nazi flags are showing is they are showing support for the Nazis. So this goose is being welcomed and the goose represents the Nazis. We know that the goose represents the Nazis because they've got a Nazi swastika hanging from their belt. So this person who's drawn this shows that wherever this is, and it happens to be in the Rhineland, these people are welcoming of the Nazis. The second thing that I noticed was that this goose here has two things in its mouth. Now, the first thing that it has in its mouth is an olive branch. Now, an olive branch always represents peace. The other thing it says is Pax Germanica, German peace. It's just Latin for German peace. So the goose is supposedly bringing peace. And as I wrote here, the goose means no harm. It's not trying to endanger anyone or upset anyone or do anything wrong. What we can then see as we look at the cartoon is on the floor here. Ooh, a bit of a weird annotation there. On the floor here, we have the Locarno Treaty. It's ripped and in tatters. Well, if you remember what the Locarno Treaty did, what it did was it enforced and enhanced the Treaty of Versailles. So the Germans signed in 1925 saying that they wouldn't break the border decisions made by the Treaty of Versailles. What we also have here is some text. So the cartoon is called The Goose Step. Well, the Goose Step was the name given to the German soldiers marching, and it's about the high kicks that they used to do. So that's why the whole thing is in the form of a goose, because that was the name of the German march. So this cartoon is called The Goose Step. It says, "Goosey, goosey gander, whither dost thou wander? Only through the Rhineland. Pray excuse my blunder." And this is as if the goose is saying, "Oh dear, sorry, this was a mistake." That's what a blunder is, a mistake. This was just a mistake. I wasn't meaning to come here. And of course, what that refers to is the fact, if you remember when we did our knowledge stuff the other day in our last lesson, that what Hitler was saying to his generals was, if you get stopped, pretend it was all a big mistake and turn back home. Don't engage. Don't fight, you don't need to. So the gooses pretend to be silly and ignorant. Oh dear, sorry, no, I'm here by mistake. But we can really clearly see that this is no mistake. This goose is very heavily armed. There's loads of ammunition around its neck. We've got rifles, we've got machine guns, we've got swords. all sorts of armour here. And of course, they've got a helmet on their head. So this goose is actually all geared up for war. This goose is not bringing peace. This is not a peaceful goose. It's the absolute opposite of that. So make sure that you've got a number of those annotations already written down for me, Year 9. So emphasise the fact that this goose, despite the fact that it's pretending to bring peace, that it is being welcomed by the local population. But if you remember, this wasn't an invasion, was it, by the Germans, the remilitarisation of the Rhineland? The Rhineland always remained German land, always remained German land. This was just them putting their troops back in this area. So it's bound to be that the German people supported it. So that's no surprise up there. The fact they're ripping up Locarno, obviously they're ripping up the Treaty of Versailles as well, and pretending they're doing this is almost a little bit of an accident. But we can tell that that's not really the case here. So make sure you've got some really good annotations, Year 9. What we're going to do now then is we're going to use those annotations from the last slide, and we're going to start to think about, well, how useful is this source? We're going to write our source A paragraph. So you're going to write one paragraph in a few minutes when I finished explaining this. So in order to do a really good paragraph, what I've done is I've written a few things that you need to be writing about to make sure that you do that. So the first thing you'll do is you've got to say something about, well, the source is useful because I can see. You're going to tell me about some of that content. So what does it tell us about the Rhineland? What are we discovering? So twin that up with a little bit of a starter sentence here. Source A is useful for studying Hitler's actions in the Rhineland because you might tell me about the peace. You might tell me about being loaded down with all this artillery and armaments. You might tell me about Locarno. Any of those things, any of those details. And I'd like at least 2, but preferably 3 details from what you can see in that cartoon. So that's how you're going to start this answer off. Source A is useful because I can see, and you're going to give me details from the cartoon. What you're next going to do is you're going to tell me, well, how is that supported by your own knowledge? So again, I've done a little starter sentence for you. It fits with my own knowledge because I know that, and you're going to tell me what you know about German rearmament and the remilitarisation. You might tell me about what you know about the blunder bit there. You might tell me that Hitler told his generals to retreat and pretend it was all kind of a big mistake, that they were pretending that this wasn't a big deal. You might tell me about why the local population might have been supportive. So you might mention that the Rhineland was German territory, just the Rhineland had been demilitarised permanently, and this was breaking Treaty of Locarno. You might tell me about what was done to this particular area and why under the Treaty of Versailles. So remember, the Rhineland was demilitarised to make France feel secure. They've been invaded twice through that area. So that's good knowledge that can support what is shown here, that the Germans were pretending that they weren't doing anything wrong, but everybody can see they're breaking the rules, and we can see that they're up to no good. The third bit is the bit that sometimes worries and confuses people. But you don't need to be confused or worried at all by the provenance. All the provenance is the background of the source. And the background of the source makes it useful to us. So let's just recap what we've already said. You've already said source A is useful for studying Hitler's actions in the Rhineland because, and you've given me a number of details of the cartoon. You've then said it fits with my own knowledge because I know that, and you might have told me about the Treaty of Versailles and what happened to the Rhineland. You might have told me about German rearmament, anything at all. There's knowledge that shows something about what Germany was doing. Provenance bit, you're going to tell me who it was produced by, when, and then we're going to think about, well, how's that helpful to us? So if we look at this one, it tells us up here at the top, this is a cartoon from the British magazine Punch in 1936. If we think about this cartoon, this is critical of the Germans, isn't it? Because they're being shown to be a little bit hypocritical. They're pretending that they're bringing peace. They're not bringing peace at all. They're bringing nothing but weapons and war. But they're pretending that this is all just a big mix-up, a big mistake, and they haven't got any bad intentions. Remember, it's their land. So this source was produced in Britain. Well, that's important because it gives us a British perspective of what happened. Now, we know that the British saw this as not being too troubling, because remember what the British politicians had said was, well, this was really Germany's backyard. What's it matter if they put troops in their own backyard? So you might mention that when you're talking about the province. But this particular cartoonist clearly thinks that more should have been done about it. So this shows us, and this is why it's useful, it's helpful, because it tells us that some British people did see that the Germans weren't really being peaceful and that the Germans really were aiming towards war. Maybe some of the British people knew about Hitler's aims in foreign policy that we've already been looking at. So this source was produced in Britain. It's a satirical magazine. It's like a magazine that's aiming to take the mickey out of leaders and countries, etc. It's at the time of the event. This is a direct reaction to the events in Britain, and it showed that some people in Britain were clearly not very happy by what was going on. So you've told me about the source. You've given me a little bit of knowledge, maybe 1 or 2 points that you know about what was going on in the Rhineland that matches with the cartoon. Obviously, feel free to stop, pause this, take it back if you want to hear me explaining that again. You then want to tell me where it was produced and kind of why that's useful to us. Remember, it's given us that British perspective or view. Overall, is it useful? Well, overall, this source is useful. It shows us what Germany were doing, shows us them taking their troops into the Rhineland, and that some people believe that their motivations were not good and that they were pretending that it was all innocent and that it wasn't. Just a sentence or so on that. So rather than us going through the second source now, why don't you pause this and spend between 5 and 7 minutes having a go at that paragraph? This is just one paragraph. If it contains all of those things, Year 9, you're going to do a really good job on this. So give yourself 5 or 7 minutes and have a go. Keep this slide up so you can see not only what I'm asking you to write about, but those sentence starters that are going to help you and give you clues as to what you should be writing. I hope you felt that first source went really well. We're going to have a look at the second source now. This is a very different view of what was happening in the Rhineland in 1936. So source B, again, I just want you to spend a couple of minutes listing or writing next to the source if you printed it out, underlining, annotating anything that this source tells you about what was happening in the Rhineland. What can we find out about the remilitarisation from this source? Pause this now and see what you can work out. Okay, so let's have a look at what I got in terms of my annotations. So what I got this time around, the first thing that I pointed out was at the very beginning of this, Hitler is saying that they had no army worth mentioning at this point. So remember, this is in 1936. No army worth mentioning. In other words, their army was very small. That's what Hitler is saying there. So he's saying we were really weak at this point and we could have been stopped. And he mentions the French in particular. If the French had taken serious action, so they'd done something, anything, they would have been stopped. This is him kind of saying that the French were silly and the French really should have taken action. He mentions that they would have been easily defeated, not just defeated, but easily defeated. And that's emphasising again how weak they were and how Germany at this point were not ready for war. And so he's saying only a small amount of troops would have been necessary here in order to stop the Germans. Our resistance would have been over in a few days. In other words, they might have been fighting for a few days and then the French would have won and it would have been a big disaster for Germany. So this is Hitler emphasising essentially how clever he was and how silly the French were. So there's a little bit less to annotate this time, but there's certainly 4 things that you can pick out and record now. If you jot those down in your book now, that'd be great. Okay, so let's have a look at our second paragraph. So it's still the same question. How useful are sources A and B to a historian studying Hitler's actions in the Rhineland? We're still writing about the same things. We've still got our same sentence starters. All of that stuff is still the same. So let's do it for the second one. So content, well, we've just annotated the content. So why is the content useful? What does it tell us? Well, remember, we're going to talk about as many things as possible about what we can see. Source B is useful for studying Hitler's actions in the Rhineland because tell me about what he says about the army. Tell me what he says about the French. Tell me about what would have happened had they had a battle and about how long that battle would have lasted. So your start of your answer is going to be using those annotations that we did on the last slide. Your second sentence, or it might be a third or fourth because you might give me a few examples in terms of content. Your next bit of writing in your paragraph is going to be on your own knowledge again. It fits with my own knowledge because I know that. Well, he talks about them having no army worth mentioning. If you remember when we looked at the content lesson last time round, he actually took 32,000 troops into the Rhineland. I would hardly call that no army worth mentioning. He also, he's saying there's no army worth mentioning. By this point, we're in 1936, March 1936. Hitler came to power in Germany in January 1933 and immediately started rearming. So him saying they had no army worth mentioning, he'd spent 3 years building up the army. We know by 1939 there's almost 1 million in the army. We know that around this time it's about 500,000. They certainly had not got no army worth mentioning. They were pretty strong by this point. He also mentions if the French had taken serious action, we would have been easily defeated. Well, actually, there wouldn't have been a defeat at all, because what we know from our own knowledge is if the French had taken serious action, the German generals had been given the order by Hitler to turn around, to not engage, to pretend it had all been a terrible accident and go back home. He was worried that they would have been defeated, and so he told them not to fight. So there wouldn't have been a battle at all. So again, they wouldn't have been easily defeated, but what we do know from our knowledge is that actually they wouldn't have fought in the first place. So those two bits of knowledge are things that you could mention next. So again, let's think about what we'd already have written here. You'll already have told me about what you can see in this source. It's useful because he says, and pick out 2 or 3 things that Hitler says here. It's also useful because I know, and you're going to talk about what I've just talked to you about the size of the army, about what actually would have happened if the French had resisted and put up a fight. We're now going to go and look at the provenance again, the background of this source. So the source was produced by, well, this source is from Hitler. Now, it's a little bit vague here. The last one was very clear. It was from 1936. This one, it says some years after 1936. So this source is a little bit less useful to us in some ways because it's very vague. We don't really know when it's from. But we do know it's from Hitler. And that does really help us because it gives us his perspective on it. Because what he's trying to do by writing this particular source is he's showing how clever he was, how he outsmarted the French. And even though he had a rubbish army, he was able to win this particular battle, despite the fact they didn't actually fight. And he was able to achieve this simply by bluffing and making people kind of bend to his will. So this is really useful because it shows us that Hitler thought that he'd been really clever here, and he's bragging about his own achievements. So again, at the very end, just one sentence. So overall, this source is useful because it tells us that Hitler himself wasn't confident when he remilitarized the Rhineland and didn't know that he'd be successful. So this is also a useful source. So again, I want you to pause this now and I want you to write your second paragraph. Again, around 5 minutes writing, but please don't spend any more than 7 because you wouldn't have any more than that in a real exam. And I want to get you trained in doing that. And also keep this up in front of you, rewind it if you need to, re-listen to bits to make sure you cover all of these areas. So finally, we have to write a conclusion. We have to make a judgment about how useful sources A and B are in studying Hitler's actions in the Rhineland. Now, one quick thing to make very, very clear. The question is not asking you which source is more useful. You're not making a choice between the sources. That's not what this is about. So in your conclusion, you are going to tell me that both sources are useful. They are, aren't they? Think about all the things we've been able to say about each of them. They're useful because they tell us about what was going on in the Rhineland, about how it was viewed both in Britain and in Germany. Also, they tell us about how it was viewed not only in 1936, but in the years afterwards by Hitler as well. So in your conclusion, just 4 or 5 minutes, it's probably not even going to be that long, year 9, you're just writing a few sentences about why they're useful. Base it on what you've already written. They're useful because they tell me. You might give a couple of examples of what they tell you. They're useful because they fit in with your knowledge. And again, you may reflect on that. And they're useful because of where they're from. They're from different times and places. That's always useful when we're studying an event to get different perspectives. So 4 or 5 minutes, just bringing it all together with a conclusion, making sure you're saying how useful they are. Are they quite useful? So overall, I think both sources are useful. You might go further and say they're quite useful, they're very useful. But you're definitely learning something from each of the sources. But it's not about saying A is better than B or B is better than A. It's about talking about how you can use them together. Because these sources, when used together, they show what some people in Britain felt And they also show about what Hitler thought in the years afterwards, and how he showed off about how clever he was and how he got away with it. Obviously, they're not giving us the full answer, aren't they? They're not telling us everything about Hitler's actions in the Rhineland. So they are limited to a certain extent, but all sources will be. Pause this, have a go at it. Once you've done, it's important to send your answer to your teacher to get some feedback. And make sure you return to the lesson 5 minutes before the end. So hopefully you've had at least 15 minutes worth of writing time, and then send your answer to your teacher, please.